Greetings and welcome to Remedy Radio, the show that communicates solutions, helping you find, learn, and eventually teach remedies for life, love, liberty, and the achievement of both happiness and satisfaction for you and your loved ones. Removing your uncertainty and inspiring your curiosity. Episode 1 of Remedy Radio is entitled Fulfilling Needs, the Power of Communication.
Welcome, folks, to Remedy Radio. I'm your host, Adam Dodds, with my colleagues, unbelievably talented colleagues, Paul Verge and Robert Christy here today joining us. Remedy Radio, your place for communicating solutions. So we provide to you some really interesting topics of conversations touching on a whole bunch of different fields. So one of the first questions that came up today here in the office was, what does the idea of communication mean to you? So Paul, you want to take this one?
The idea of communication, well, to me it's really the act of conveying energy in the form of ideas and thoughts to someone else or putting them out into the public consciousness so that they can be picked up and understood and received and acted upon. So in order to get our needs fulfilled, we need to communicate our needs and do it accurately in a way that people will both understand and be able to re-explain to others.
Right, so there's a process in the whole communicating, and I think that process has been skewed over time, and correct me if I'm wrong, but a lot of people out there don't necessarily know how to properly communicate, hence the needs not being fulfilled. So communication is important in fulfilling needs, in being able to have your own needs fulfilled and be able to fulfill other people's needs, right? So it's important in an everyday, and it affects everyone, right? So
yeah, you can't function without communicating. You really, without the ability to transcend your physical boundaries through conveying this energy out of your mouth or through your body language or whatever, that people can understand and pick up and act upon, because we can't go around just forcing each other to do stuff. It's how we get along. It's how we build things together. It's how we all interaction on the planet is based on communication. So it's the most important facet of the human experience or the life experience. And if we don't know the rules of communication, if we don't know the ordered methodologies of effectively communicating, what we are resulted with is conflict. And I think everyone in life is trying to either overcome or avoid conflict. So in this episode of Remedy Radio on essentially communication, we want to try and discuss not only the facets of communication and why we find ourselves in conflict, but also to give you, the audience, tools to more effectively communicate in a conscious and nonviolent manner.
Yeah, well, I would like to add that I would maybe clarify something there, that we actually can communicate violently. We can do it with coercion. We're living that. That's essentially what we're living. But what we don't want is that anymore. Mm-hmm. And so the way communication, I believe, works naturally for humans and all animals, is that it's a communication is to get our needs met. And so I think that moving forward in the future that we want to create for ourselves would be to first figure out what our needs are, because most of us don't actually know what our needs are, and then learning to communicate that in a way that we can get those needs met. And once we actually recognize our needs, we'll realize that they're pretty much the same for everybody. Mm-hmm. So what we will end up in turn doing is meeting other people's needs, and thereby feeling good about ourselves and other people, and everybody's getting their needs met.
Well, that's the whole point.
Yeah, you find satisfaction in life through the fulfilling of your needs and the needs of others. And it's a cyclical kind of pattern in that, the more you try and fulfill other people's needs, I don't know whether it's a karmic thing or whatever, but that ends up coming back to you, and those people feel inclined, usually, to help fulfill your needs as well, because you end up recognizing that we are all the mirror or the reflection of each other, and the more we're giving, the more we're really living.
Right, and it's so easy to do. People don't really understand the amount of effort it takes to really fulfill someone's needs. And at the end of the day, everyone has the same needs, right? It's part of survival. If you don't have a need, you don't survive, right? So that's my definition of a need, is you can't live without it. Mm-hmm. So appreciation, in my eyes, is something that people can't live without. So just showing somebody a smile, of appreciation, genuine appreciation, I think can completely change a perspective to, start a snowball effect.
Yeah, it totally creates a ripple effect, and somebody could be having a horrible day, and their interaction with you and the way you communicate could be the one moment that turns their day into an even worse day, or into stopping the momentum of a bad day and turning it into something positive. And you put them back on the upswing just with a smile. Like, how low effort is that? But just putting out, instead of a confrontational kind of energy, because a lot of people walk around and they're either expecting something bad to happen to them or expecting something good to happen to them. Or maybe they're just saying, I create my own luck, and the only things that happen to me are what I really bring up upon myself. But either way, somebody smiling at you is going to make you stop and think for a second, what did I do to deserve that smile? Right? And that you might respond with a smile instinctively, which someone else might see, and it can snowball, like you said. It can have this ripple effect where you don't know what the end result of your good deed is going to necessarily be.
Right. So that is in and of itself a method of communication, right? Sending somebody a smile is a method of communication, right? So it's not a dominance-based method of communication. It's an empathetic-based method of communication. Hey, you're another human being, right? Hey, you're just like me, right?
Why wouldn't we smile at each other?
Exactly. That's something that really confuses me, is how can you go about your day not smiling at anyone? I find it hard to do. I find it really hard to do myself. But
I think a lot of people internalize the problems or issues that they're having, and the end result of that is you get withdrawn into the universe of your own ego, where you think your problems, even though they might not be the biggest problems in the world, you feel like they're the biggest problems in the world. But you don't have a terminal disease, you're not in Iraq being murdered by US soldiers. If you actually take stock of your life in North America, more often than not, you're actually pretty well off and pretty blessed. Even those of us who are going through struggle and hard times right now still have it better than most people in like a third world country, or in Japan, say. So taking stock of that and looking like, oh wait, I can feed myself, I have people that love me, I have clothes on my back, I can appreciate where I'm at.
yeah,
And then that allows you to put things in perspective, because if you dwell too long in a place of feeling the burden of all this, the pressure of your problems in life, and you don't communicate that to anyone else, that pressure can build up like a steam cooker, and eventually you can have a nervous breakdown or a bursting of the pressure, I guess. So communicating your needs, communicating your problems, but doing it in a respectful, effective manner that's not confrontational or intending to create conflict, is going to help you achieve your goals or get your needs fulfilled. But too often our egos either get defensive or take things personally.
we expect it.
And we come with all these presumptions, assumptions, and expectations, and when they're not met, we're conditioned to we're conditioned to react emotionally instead of responding intellectually or thoughtfully.
Right.
Well, I think that our lifestyle creates a situation whereby we're always in a state of stress or something, because we've been conditioned. Basically our lifestyle creates such a situation that it's really stressful. I mean, you have to work. Most parents now have two parents working, and the kids are raised by the state, and everybody's just trying to make ends meet, get the mortgage paid, right? And they keep getting robbed, right? We're constantly being robbed, right? So we've got all these institutions that are constantly taking our money and our energy from us. But
then again, what do you expect with the dominance-based method of communication, right? So when you start with even the way you communicate with others, you really do start to change your surroundings, your perceptions on the world, right? Because you're not using dominance-based methods of communication. You're not being part of that whole, concept that doesn't work,
You're making requests instead of demands.
Right.
People they go into defense mode when they think someone's making a demand upon them, because it's like, how dare you make a demand? Usually people make exchanges, right? And it's a little bit more of a friendly terms. You've got something I need, I've got something you need, let's negotiate, come to an agreement, win-win.
Right.
Whereas usually when someone's making a demand, it's almost always posturing as if it's going to be win-lose.
Right.
You know what I mean? And so people get to that defensive mode. So now they're anticipating an attack, which again, then now you're focused on creating a conflict, and then eventually the conversation can degenerate into a conflict. And once it gets to that level of conflict, almost nobody really gets their needs fulfilled, because it ends up being a lot of emotional rhetoric going back and forth. So the idea of being able to communicate your emotions, not through punching a hole in the wall or yelling at somebody, but simply telling them, right now, I'm feeling angry. Not, right now, you made me angry and I'm going to take it out on you, but explaining, I feel this way because of this, and how do we move forward? How do we come to an agreement where I don't have to feel angry anymore, you don't have to feel the way you feel if it's affecting you negatively, and we can both walk away from this having learned and being better off for the experience.
Right.
Well, I think that starts with us, because we can make requests of people, but we're not conditioned to hear requests. That's when that's the sort of it starts. So when somebody makes a demand on me, it's then the way I interpret that. So I have to turn that into a request.
Right.
And then see that as a request and be able to.
So we're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to talk a little bit more. Thanks for joining us. Welcome back, folks. Thanks for joining us again here on Remedy Radio. We were just picking up where we left off, talking about communication and the best ways to communicate and effectively put your idea over to your counterpart. So, Rob, we left sort of off on talking about how to communicate, and specifically what you talked about was...
Well, I think we were talking about requests versus demands.
Right.
And so the key to communication, and this is what I'm learning, I'm still trying to master this myself, but is that we have to be able to practice these things ourselves. So when somebody is making a demand on you, it's up to us to then take that and see the request that's being made. Because we're not meaning to be violent. It's just the way we've been trained to communicate with each other. So it's up to us to see demands as requests, and then relay that back to the person that's talking to you as you recognizing what their needs are, and then being able to try to address whatever those needs are. So it's up to us first to
Reflect the request back to make sure it's accurate.
Right.
I hear you saying this. Is this what you're saying?
Right.
Then give them the opportunity to correct you or to agree with you, right?
And not to take it personally or to get emotional over the fact that they're saying, do this or do that or whatever. Right? Which I do. I'm not free of it. I'm pretty sure we all do. So
I think, one of the biggest sources of conflict in communication is that people make judgments based on not understanding. I don't understand what you're saying, so you must be crazy, or you must be an idiot, or what you're saying must be not worth listening to, simply because I don't understand.
Comprehend.
I don't comprehend. So
because we've learned that understand means something different.
Yeah, stand under. Exactly. So, but when we're talking about understanding, we're not talking about the legal.
Right.
We're talking about sort of comprehension, but also a deeper knowing, like really being able to absorb the understanding in terms of like logical understanding.
Yeah.
So, in order to, once you identified needs and you can put yourself in the other person's shoes to see what their needs are, that's when you're going to have the most effective kind of dialogue, because then you're both working towards prioritized goals that more often than not, you'll find the most fulfillment from those life-affirming and life-supportive goals, as opposed to, getting together to go plan some sort of destructive escapade. So.
Right, and that's where us getting to know what our needs truly are will then help us recognize, because if we don't know what our own needs are, how are we going to recognize it in somebody else?
Yeah.
And because we're so detached from what our needs truly are, because most of our culture is not life affirming, and it's so destructive, and we.
Yeah, you can talk about how destructive our culture is, right?
Well, I mean, when it sounds like a request, it's way easier, and you're way more inclined to do something for someone, right? Be back at 10 p.m. And it's like, okay, well, is this a request or a demand? Because it sounds like a demand, and that's why, in my opinion, kids rebel, right? Because we're submerged in a dominance-based
Authoritarian kind of culture.
Exactly, right?
Mm.
So don't do anything unless you're going to do it with the enthusiasm of a child, right? I got to give props to Marshall Rosenberg out there, who we've been studying for quite a while now, and he's, been giving us so many jewels,
Who's Marshall Rosenberg? Can you tell me more about him and what he has developed?
He's developed a method of communication called nonviolent communication or conscious communication, or there's and he's just a very, very well-spoken man who has separated the difference between dominance-based and empathetic-based communications, and he's got animals and he talks with puppets to give examples, and it's really, really informative because he has a giraffe and a jackal, and those are both reflecting of the different types of communication. So a giraffe has one of the biggest hearts of all the animals, right? So that's why he picks a giraffe. And then
it's the most empathetic animal.
Yeah.
Based on its heart size, I see.
And then he has a jackal, which of course, I mean, I'm sure you can picture what a jackal does.
Yeah,
and
mocking and laughter and.
Yeah, and so when he breaks it down to its most basic forms, it's really easy to understand why dominance-based doesn't work, and it's only a matter of time until it fails, right? And so empathetic works the best because you're developing a trust between two individuals, and that trust keeps getting stronger and stronger every day, right? So.
And I guess the other issue is learning to build that trust accurately, because when we're dealing with the kind of persuasive rhetoric that sounds good, you have to kind of question it to be like, okay, does this have fallacies? Is this trying to trick me into thinking a certain way for a certain agenda? And coming to understand that that we don't necessarily have a way to discern fact from fiction when we're trying to establish trust, right? We don't want to give our trust to an authority that doesn't have our best interest at heart. Otherwise, it's kind of like paying for your own slavery in a sense.
Yeah.
So, in communication, part of understanding, part of looking at the other person that you're talking with, and imagining yourself as them, is to employ this kind of set of tools so that all the information that you're not only taking in but putting back out has gone through this step, or these 3-step process essentially.
Mm-hmm.
So you're identifying what you're talking about, or having the knowledge, having the understanding of what you're talking about, or the logic or the understanding, and being able to communicate that knowledge and understanding as wisdom and sharing it through the rhetoric. So mentioning Marshall Rosenberg and conscious communication or nonviolent communication, coupled with this Trivium-based method of critical thinking, if you take those tools in combination, you have the potential to become a very, very effective speaker, effective communicator.
Powerful.
Yeah, who not only can get what they need, but help other people achieve their needs as well.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Yeah. Well, I think you do get your needs fulfilled by fulfilling other people's needs, right?
Fulfilling needs is a gift, not a demand.
Yeah, that's another thing he says.
Armor Marshall's.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And when you... Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say you have to reframe how you're taking things in. Like Rob said, a lot of us are trained to take in a request, so a lot of times very simple, peaceful request, as if it's a huge demand. And we respond quite immaturely, and it's, like Adam said, having the enthusiasm of a child is when a child is really into doing something, it's almost hard to break their concentration. They're locked into that moment. Whereas if you try and make a child do something they don't want to do, they have the potential to emotionally freak out. It's just like, you're ruining my chi, man.
Everyone's
You're
seen
ruining
a
my
child,
buzz."
yeah.
And that's
Freak
part of
out,
the societal conditioning is that, and as Rob can expound upon, we've been left as adulterated children. We're not grown-ups. We're adult children. So maybe you can talk about that concept.
Well, Rob always says about knowing who you are. I don't want to, put words in your mouth, but those are coming out of your mouth, so...
Well, yeah, I guess in the end it is, and so...
We think we're grown-ups when we turn 18, right?
Right, yeah, well, adults, right? I mean, the word adult, the only other place it's used is an adulterate. So, to me, that means that there's something more going on to an adult, and so if you look at the whole system, our whole system of communication, of education, of government, everything is designed to take us away from learning who we are and living that, and governing ourselves, taking care of ourselves and each other. And so we are just big children, and we don't have a clue. I mean, turn the power off, take away the gas, what do we do?
Take away the internet.
Right. What do we do? I mean, we all just turns into blobs of jelly and we die because we don't know how to grow food. We don't know how to take care of, we don't know how to survive. And so we are, like there's a lot of people who talk about the nanny state. And, some people say we like government. We just want better government. Well, to me, that's just, you want a better nanny. So to me, we have to grow up and govern ourselves, and then most of the stuff that we see as problems will disappear because they'll cease to be problems.
Right. And, we like to see problems as creative ways to solutions, right? Here at Remedy Radio. So stick with us. We'll be back after this quick break, and we thank you for joining us again here at Remedy Radio. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks for joining us again on Remedy Radio. Picking up where we left off, Rob was talking about knowing who you are in the grand scheme of things, and having the ability to respond, be responsible, and that comes along with knowing who you are, right? And so, Rob.
Responsibility.
Yeah.
Paul, you're good with responsibility. Why don't you take this one?
Well, since we're talking about defining terms, maybe a lot of people get words confused because both our education system and the culture in general kind of propounds these ideas that words like responsibility means obligation, when it really means your ability to respond to a situation. So people are like, oh, you need to take responsibility for this and for that. And people kind of like, oh, I don't want to do that. That's kind of like a childish response because you haven't formulated the ability to respond properly, to respond like a grown-up. And so you feel like everything is an obligation, and yet you don't remember, agreeing to these terms and conditions and these contracts necessarily, because most of us have done it unwittingly. And so our ability to respond is tarnished and becomes simply just reactions. And reactions are what children do, because reactions are usually emotionally based, not rooted in logic, not usually thoughtful or considerate of what the ramifications are going to be. And that's when people, shut up, the grown-ups are talking, is because a child is going to pipe up and not have the consideration of what the effect their words or the weight that their words will carry. That's why a child will interrupt a conversation with a a silly non sequitur because they're not putting the consideration out there. Whereas grown-ups, as opposed to adults, who are working towards like a common goal or common ground, are going to make sure that their words and terms are chosen carefully to make sure that there's the greatest amount of efficiency and understanding so that the needs of everyone get met accurately. A child doesn't worry about fulfilling needs because usually somebody's always fulfilling the needs for them, and they haven't made that transition. And I think that's when you make a true transition from child to grown-up, as opposed to child to adult, is when you have the capability of fulfilling your own needs independently.
I would like to maybe correct one little thing there, is that from what I've found, children are extremely profound, and they use their words. I mean, they do play around, and they do.
Yeah, moments.
They do, yeah, and so, but they're more tuned in because we've been adulterated. We just sort of blab on, and we talk about stuff that is maybe not necessary to talk about. So what I found, kids can be actually, they're more tuned in. So
Well, your kids are amazingly tuned in. I babysit Rob's kids every once in a while, and wow, unbelievable. One, I think it was Aurora, who's like 3 years old, who asked me, why do we have to do this? And I said, well, because. And she said, because is not a reason. I was blown away, you know? A kid, how a child can be so in tune and be so attentive to communication, you know? And I think that's chipped away at, you know, and it's taken away slowly, you know? And so if our car breaks down, then we start beating the tire up, you know? And you see somebody with a hammer beating on a tire, and you're like, what are you doing? And he's having a meltdown, right? He can't separate the problem, right?
From the overall
situation, right?
yeah, I guess my point was it would actually behoove us to maybe shut up once in a while and listen to the kids.
Yeah, no, I do agree. There's wisdom because they haven't, at a certain point, they haven't been conditioned as much as us, and so they'll have this kind of unfiltered wisdom, which our conditioning doesn't allow us to necessarily see or appreciate.
Yeah,
and yeah, I can definitely see that.
you treat them like they're children. Oh, they wouldn't know.
We treat their words with no value.
But they wouldn't know stems from a dominance-based
Well, it stems from that's
communication.
how we were treated.
Yeah.
Right.
We were treated like we were kids, and we wouldn't know anything.
Yeah.
And it's like,
So you've grown up
pass
thinking,
that on.
I don't know anything, right?
Or you think that your kids couldn't possibly know anything more than you, because you're like, oh, everything they know is because of me.
Right.
But they're also putting two and two together themselves in a way,
Uh-huh.
right?
right.
So it's in a way, and I think you can agree with this. Having kids is like a reflection of yourself,
Oh yeah.
and so you see your own flaws in communication and personality challenges and stuff in your own kids.
Right.
They reflect, and you're just like, oh, you're
Well-
forcing me to look at myself.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. We're so conditioned to hate ourselves, to not have any self-esteem, to not really value ourselves. And when we have kids, you see that, and it's like you have to love kids, but you hate yourself. Like it's this real weird dichotomy you're in, right? It's like you love these things, but you hate yourself. It's your conditioning, right? So
We're
then
externalizing a lot too.
right, and then they do what you do, and you're like, and it
Reminds you of what you haven't totally.
it's,
And I think that's indicative of again, part of the conditioning, and it reflects in how much conflict is in our communication. But we tend to externalize all responsibility, right? We, instead of saying, I'm going to respond appropriately and do it independently, we want to blame everything outside of ourselves so that we don't have to be held up to the consequences. So it's, you made me mad. You know, this group did this to me. These people did this to me. So it leaves you in a place where you can only ever be this perpetual victim reacting to situation after situation, instead of you're in control of your life. Most of the problems that affect you, whether you want to take responsibility or not, are usually self-generated, the problems. It's you know, if you got pulled over for a problem, it's because you have a license and you went and applied for that license. If the tax people are bugging you, it's because you applied for a social insurance number. So on and so forth. In terms of, we'll get into a situation and we'll instantly want to cast the blame out on everyone else, where it's, in reality, we usually walk into situations just not very aware of what's going on.
Yeah.
And then the problem makes us suddenly hyper aware, but it gives us tunnel vision. And so this communicating is what brings about the learning that allows us to get out of any situation or to solve any problem.
Yeah. And it just made me think about the whole children, the issue with children, and children are constantly trying to break us of our conditioning. And it's like a race to condition them before they can decondition us, because they're constantly in our face showing us what our crap is. Mm-hmm. They're in your face going, this is your crap, this is your crap, this is your crap all the time. And instead we're trying to stop that and stop them from showing us our crap and condition them so that
to accept our crap,
to accept
Bite your tongue.
and then
Bite your
become
tongue.
that crap.
Yeah.
That we are.
Yeah.
Right.
And then we don't have to deal with the consequences.
Exactly.
Of our own
Yeah.
So we normalize the crap levels, and then everyone's just like, well, we've been sitting in crap for this long, it must have always been like this.
Yeah.
And then that's kind of acquiescing to the status quo. Whereas, as Adam mentioned, in our dominant-based society, if we can almost like plant our feet and stop going against the dominant flow, we can create a counterflow of conscious nonviolent communication.
Right, and you can do that by simply asking questions, right? You shouldn't go against any flow, but I think that you should ask questions if you're going with the flow, right?
Well, yeah, you can divert the flow into a different direction, I guess you could
Yeah,
say,
yeah.
instead of trying to create resistance and conflict.
Will you be going with the flow and then questioning anybody who's not, and trying to stop the flow? So.
Well, yeah, it's like going with the flow is a concept that a lot of people, you wouldn't go with the flow if it was heading off a cliff, you know what I mean? You would try and divert it or create some form of getting out, So, but if you can learn to corral or control the flow or influence the flow in terms of to something more life-affirming and life-supportive, I think that's a wholly positive thing.
Well, I think we have to see the flow, that the flow actually is life-affirming. So the flow would never be going off a cliff. That would be something resisting the flow maybe and trying to lead it that way, and then you'd be going, why are you trying to lead everybody off a cliff? Because the flow doesn't go that way.
Maybe I'm talking about the status quo flow.
Then I think that would be a good way to differentiate.
Yeah.
Because I think the true flow would never take us off a cliff. And that's
Yeah,
what
if
we need to
anything, it
connect to.
appears that we're going off a cliff, but it's a learning experience to teach us to fly, or whatever necessary component
Right.
comes out of it. So then, in terms of communicating and the reason why people aren't necessarily willing to stop and listen and consider the other, what is it about our personalities? Do you think it's something to do with our ego that makes us defensive, or the need to be right as opposed to finding the truth?
Well, I think it has to do with it's something that I learned in something that I did a while ago called reevaluation counseling, and a big thing that they focus on is oppression, and oppression's a big thing because oppression starts at the top, and people are oppressed and it just gets worked down. So there's all the different kinds of oppression, which is feminism, sexism, whatever the isms. But they all start somewhere and they work their way down, and they become a myriad of different isms on their way down until they get to the children. And we go back to the children, and then they get oppressed and they become oppressors.
So just stick with us, folks. We're just going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to touch base again on the isms and how they come down the chain of hierarchical structure. So thanks again for tuning in, folks. We'll be back in just a second. Welcome back, folks. Thanks for joining us again here on Remedy Radio. Communicating solutions all day long. We're touching on some really, really important, interesting topics of conversation, such as the isms. Rob was just, before we left off, we touched about the hierarchical structures that comprise our dominance-based communication methods, isms being one of them. So just to go back into that.
Well, yeah, I mean, if you look at everything from our religion to our government to everything, it's a top-down structure, and so somebody is dictating something to somebody, and it just trickles down in everything, and so yeah. I don't know.
Without question, right? Without question, that's the whole thing, right? Do it without question. So it's dominance. It's do this, right? And don't question what I'm telling you.
Authoritative.
Right.
It's somebody, the first step to make you forget who you are is to get you to defer your power, your creative power, your decision-making power to someone else who doesn't deserve to have that authority. And if it's reinforced enough times, you must listen to the teacher. You must listen to the priest or the parent, even though sometimes these people are wrong. And yet the child is hammered upon with a lot of fallacious logic, like you were talking about. Because is not a reason. Do this. Why? Because I said so. Okay, so now you've told that child to basically listen and not question you, and by extension not question other people who claim authority. So if you teach your child to be super obedient, and yet someone else comes up and says, do this for me right now, and they can emulate the same authoritative energy, that child's going to end up listening to them. Whereas I think the most positive thing that you can instill on your child is a healthy sense of critical thinking, skepticism, and questioning things to get at the truth of the matter rather than just being right all the time.
Best form of protection is a good question, right?
Absolutely.
3 or 4 good questions will also lead right to the core of the intention of whoever's asking them, right?
Exactly. Well, anybody who's trying to impose their authority over you or anything like that, then the best thing you can have is good questions.
And know how to ask them properly, because a lot of people ask questions in an accusatory or a dominant manner, which immediately puts people on a defensive, because they take the question as an attack, right? Especially if you're asking a question that you already know the answer to, and the person you're asking knows that you know the answer and that they're not going to like giving it, you're not going to really move anywhere, because then they're going to think you're just condescending them. So you have to approach things from a genuine place, where even if you're not agreeing with the person, you're appreciating that they're still civilly communicating with you. And that's kind of how constructive progress is made, is through that kind of civility of consideration. Right? I'm thinking about your needs, you're thinking about my needs. We're not trying to game each other to make it a win-lose scenario, but we're elevating our consciousness to realize, oh my goodness, there is more than these false dichotomies. We can actually find win-win, triple win, quadruple win scenarios,
right,
if we are creative enough.
Win-lose is dominance-based, right?
Yeah, it's also the easiest, shortest path
Yeah.
to find a solution.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? But the end result is that you have all these profit models based on misery and death and destruction, as opposed to creation and life and compassion.
So the whole win-lose thing is synonymous to the dominant-based methods of communications that we're working with on a day-to-day basis. So when we really pick apart the whole concept of win-lose and dominance, you're really left with, eventually I'm going to lose, but I'd rather win all the time. So I'm going to go with the whole survival of the cooperatives instead of survival of the fittest, right? The whole dominance-based thing stems in so many different areas of our lives, right, that it's almost hidden, right? And then
Well, it's hidden in front of us.
Well, yeah.
And through the dumbing down process, it's like every year of conditioning that you have is an additional layer of thick glasses that filter your perceptions, essentially, with bias and prejudice and apathy. And one of the biggest things, we're trying to get across is to cure this apathy, because a lot of people just give up. They're like, you know what, communication's too hard. I'm not going to bother being in a relationship. I'm not going to bother having a family. I'm not going to bother trying to get along with my boss. I'm not going to...
Yeah.
They just give up on trying to communicate effectively, because they're like, I'm communicating in this way, at this vibration, on this radio station, and no one else is tuning into my station. So instead of saying, well, maybe I should broaden my horizons, they just blame everyone else for not having the capacity to tune into their radio station.
Yeah.
And that's like, hey, if that's the end, how you end up, then great, but how's that working out?
Yeah.
You're not going to lead to a fulfilling life by shunning everyone that you know.
Right. I'm
Yeah.
not having my needs fulfilled. I want my needs fulfilled is a demand,
Can't beat them, join them.
Yeah.
Well,
It's a good condition.
when somebody says I'm not having my needs fulfilled, at least that's an honest expression. It's just, okay, so now where do we
Yeah,
move
it's
forward,
pretty
right?
Right.
If you stay stuck or in a kind of grudgy mode of, Well, you didn't fulfill my needs a long time ago, so I'm not going to let you fulfill my needs now. Again, it doesn't.
Psychological games we play.
Well, it becomes like a revenge, and again, it's dominance based.
Yeah.
So we have to almost, and it's hard to do, especially when we're tempted to react from an emotional place. We have to try and analyze our communication and put it. We already have these filters on there that are affecting us negatively. Let's put a few positive filters on there.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and say, hey, when I'm talking, am I boring this person? Am I speaking relevantly? Am I anticipating their needs? Are they genuinely listening to what I'm saying? Instead of just like, blah, 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 blah.
Do they actually care?
Yeah, do they actually care? And a lot of people, you'd be surprised how many people talk just to hear their own voices and not considering whether anybody cares about what they're actually saying.
Speaking of caring what you're actually saying, sorry to jump in, Paul, but I think we should encourage a lot of our listeners to log on to our website.
We're going to take a quick break. Paul, hold that thought. Thanks for coming back, folks. We were just taking a quick break, and Paul was left talking about how we often just keep rolling on and talking without actually considering the other person we're talking to. So the thoughts that we hold in our own brains, we're not willing to let go of our own thoughts, and due to that, we often get into some pretty sticky situations, right? So talk a little bit about that.
Well, yeah, let's define the term sophism, which is like the art of sophisticated rhetoric, which is essentially you're arguing not to win the truth, but to be right. It's like someone yelling past the point when they've already been proven wrong. They just keep yelling because they don't want to appear to have lost the fight. And it doesn't end up getting anywhere, and it'll fulfill our ego for maybe 5 seconds, and then you kind of have to come back to reality. And so if I would almost say sophism is a lot of times antithesis to true logic and reason, because it's usually taking a weaker idea and trying to dress it up with fallacious logic to make it appear at least emotionally appealing.
Mm-hmm.
And then you'll see politicians, CEOs, actors engage in a lot of sophisticated rhetoric because they want to appear benevolent, or they want to appear as if their positions, which would normally be morally untenable, they make them appear rational and reasonable. And so people get behind ideas like invading a sovereign country and murdering the people and taking their resources and leaving them with unmanageable debt, because somebody is able to package it in a way that's persuasive rhetoric using deception, and that's sophism.
So are you saying that sophism is kind of like a poop cake with really nice icing?
It's a poop cake with a thin chocolate spread all around the edge. So
And a
an
cherry
unwitting
on top?
person without critical thinking is going to be like, hey,
Yummy.
cherry, chocolate, hey, you know what, I'm just going to dig right in. Where a discerning person will be like, I don't know, this cake's
There's
just
a
sitting
hint
here.
of, there's a smell.
Something doesn't quite smell right.
in the air.
It smells not fishy, but
Yeah, so in essence, it's, there's all these old adages like look before you leap, and essentially they're saying don't jump to conclusions, right? It is an emotional reaction to jump to a conclusion without having thought or weighed or processed all the contributing factors. And again, that comes from our ego's need to be right, because we have all these misconceptions and prejudices and biases that bring in how we think the world is and how we think events should be, and these expectations that we place. That as a filter is what creates a lot of misperceptions, because we're always assuming, even though we don't necessarily have a virus scanner for our mind, we're assuming all the information we take in is true and accurate, and we repeat it to each other, and then other people we've repeated it to repeat it back to us, and we hear it enough times, and we're like, well, it must be true. No one's challenged it with any counterfacts. And that might be a solid way to function, but more often than not, the facts that we've been fed have been processed, right? You're not getting the raw good stuff. You're getting a filtered version that serves certain corporate and political agendas. And so if we're making all our decisions based on that type of information, it's like we have tunnel vision without even really knowing it. because we've never had anything but tunnel vision. And suddenly you take off the tunnel vision glasses and you see there's this whole world, this whole wide range of perceptions that you could have had the whole time. And in bringing that kind of dynamic about, then your communication, instead of communicating in this tunnel vision where it's mostly dominance based, you suddenly realize you have this whole arsenal of tools where you don't have to react. You don't even have to respond necessarily until you've given it some thought. And if somebody tries to rush you, you can be like, hold on, I'm trying to formulate a thoughtful response. Would you like me to be not thoughtful and considerate? And you'll find that nonviolent communication doesn't mean not being assertive or not sticking up for yourself. It doesn't mean rolling over to whatever people want to do, but it means finding that common ground and then walking it together.
Absolutely. I think one of the...
Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, I think one of the things that was used against us as one of our greatest traits is our trust. And that's one of the things that they've used against us, because we are trusting. When it comes right down to it, we want to believe that we have the best intention for each other, and clearly that's been used against us.
I agree.
And also, I wanted to touch on listening. You touched on listening, so I wanted to expand on that. I know Adam's had some experience in that. He took a month off of speaking, so he had the ability to just listen for a while. And I've mentioned reevaluation counseling, which I did, which focuses on counseling somebody, which is sitting with somebody and listening for however many. You each take a turn listening and talking
without interruption.
Without interruption, yeah. It's not. Yeah, there's no interruption. You may offer something to try to help them. They call it. You may offer things to try to help the person.
Yeah, stimulate
it. They call them contradictions, and so you try to get them out of the pattern of thinking that they're in, because we get sort of locked in these patterns of thinking. So it's kind of like reframing a little bit, but for the most part, you just want to listen to the person, and you want to do it while you're thinking how wonderful they are. Mm-hmm. Regardless of what's coming out of their mouth, whatever it is, your judgment has to be life-affirming, regardless of what's coming out of their mouth, so that they feel comfortable enough to do what it is that they're doing, which is, they call discharging, which is just dumping stuff. And then you get a turn to do the same thing. So you're not learning to be a counselor and to do it to other people, other than other people who will reciprocate the same thing for you. And so listening becomes really important, and then judgment. And as Marshall talks about judgment are things that are life affirming. So we've been conditioned to thinking our judgment or we use our judgment by looking at people and saying whether they're right or they're wrong. And our judgment is for us to see whether things are life affirming. Will they make my life better? Then that's what my judgment's for. And will it make your life better? So I think that we need to, amongst other things, is really get to the root of what these things actually mean, and what we need to come to a common ground in defining our terms. And so, what is judgment? There's the egoic judgment,
hasty judgments.
Yeah, and so yeah.
So how was not speaking for a month? Like, what opportunities did that afford you in terms of your listening game?
Well, I think for one of the first things is that I realized everyone had gifts to give. But as long as they knew that you weren't going to talk, they were just ready to pour out the gifts, right? So
like a confessional almost.
Almost, yeah. And I think that for the most part, everyone wants to give something. Everyone wants to give. You ask somebody, if I gave you $1 million, what would you do with it? And they often say, well, I'd take all my friends on a trip. So they genuinely, everyone wants to give, but nobody out there, or there's very few people out there that are willing to accept gifts, which means to listen, right? And to really genuinely listen. Like you said, you sit there across the person. Are you actually listening to them, or are you thinking about the own dialogue you're having with your own brain about what you're going to say next. And we often do it, right? And it's that we have to sort of calm down a little bit, right? And not be afraid to lose ourselves in another person's conversation.
Yeah. To be
Right?
in the moment of that conversation instead of pre-planning what you want to say to sound smart or relevant.
Exactly.
And then, whereas you're thinking of your own kind of, like you said, the ego.
Right.
Having your heart in a conversation where people can see it in your eyes, you're genuinely engaged, you're genuinely listening, you're genuinely anticipating receiving and giving the gifts, and it becomes this like magical cyclical dance that people kind of do, which is where the idea of people having chemistry comes from, that intercommunication and it just being like a wholly pleasurable experience. So
Yeah, and if we can set that up for each other, so that it's like I don't have to think about responding. I'll listen to you, genuinely listen to you, but I don't really want to respond. So if we can do that for each other, because we feel so obligated to try to help people, and try to give them advice and do all whatever we think they need, and sometimes we just need to shut up. And so sometimes the best gift we can give is just listening to somebody and letting them just dump whatever it is they got to dump, and then maybe at the end of it, but the best thing usually is just to not offer anything. Just say, yeah.
give them the opportunity to fully express themselves, and that's the thing. We're actually the harshest judges on ourselves. That's why we don't really communicate accurately, is because a lot of us are worried. How are people? We almost over-considerate. You know what I mean? We're so worried about how people are going to respond or what the consequences are going to be that we don't express ourselves fully because we're afraid of the judgment. So, is there anything?
Huge, I don't know, for myself, huge sense of freedom with not having to talk,
Yeah,
right?
the freedom to be quiet,
Yeah.
to listen, and to enjoy the stillness of life.
Ego
So,
hates that.
Remedy Radio, thanks for tuning in, guys. Stick with us.